Hello, everyone. As you can probably tell by my striped outfit as well as my prison number, I am Prison Escape Minion Michelle. Yes, I did escape. I will not express the crimes that I committed or that I was accused of committing, but regardless, I am going to be doing the Animation Friday video for this week. So I hope you all enjoy. I hope to make evil twin minion Michelle proud. So without further ado, let me address what I thought would be a cool topic to discuss for this Animation Friday. And that is my personal favorite, non-Disney animated villains. Yes, since this is animation, we're going to be talking about animation, in particular animated characters, and in this case villains, and villains that are not from the Disney canon. Now, as you probably know, Disney is really well known for their villains, and I will say that they probably do offer the best as far as interesting characteristics is concerned. But I feel like these villains, although they're not part of Disney, also offer something that's rather unique and interesting. And so I'm going to be addressing these particular characters today. Starting with Rasputin from Anastasia. Now, I know there's a lot of people who may enjoy or either dislike this film, depending on the amount of weight that the person puts as far as the historical inaccuracy, because there is a lot within this film, and it is not designed to be in any way a representation of the actual real Anastasia in any way, shape, or form, although it is using that as a means to execute a somewhat Disney-like replica. And although it is not as strong as probably a lot of other Disney works, it's still rather interesting as far as its villain is concerned, which is Rasputin. Now, some people might say that he's not really given a huge amount of weight as far as the motivation is concerned, because we don't really get a sense of his backstory or whatnot. But despite that, it's still clear that he felt wronged and felt basically discarded. So it only makes sense that he would sort of seek revenge. And the interesting thing is he's almost a dead version of himself because at one point you see him sort of going into this sort of underworld kind of setting, and then you sort of see him, singing his little song. But what I personally really enjoy about this guy is he's very intimidating. He's got a great voice. I believe Christopher Lloyd was the man who played him. I think Jim Cummings was actually the guy who did the vocals, if I'm not mistaken. But it's really good to see a villain that is so terrifying as far as his visual representation is concerned, and also to see how committed he is to really accomplishing his ultimate goal, which is really to destroy the whole Romanoff, I believe that's how you pronounce it, family. And that includes Anastasia, since she's the only surviving of the whole bloodline. So, and besides her grandma, but I guess he really doesn't care too much about the grandma, because he's like, she's gonna go eventually. Anastasia's the one we gotta worry about, because maybe she'll have a kid and then the bloodline will go on. So you really do see his kind of dedication and commitment, and he has this sort of insane kind of understanding as far as how he ultimately wishes to execute his plan. I mean, at one point you see him sort of, I guess you could say, almost kind of make a deal with really the devil and sort of sell his soul so he can, try to defeat her. And you see all of the terrors and the kind of really bizarrely creepy things that he sort of throws at Anastasia. And I think that's ultimately what gives him such a weight as far as a villain is concerned. He just has this certain amount of power. And that power can really strike you. It's really sort of like Maleficent in a way. You know, he has his sort of minions, I guess you could say, although, you know, some of them take the form of bugs, which still makes me laugh. But, you know, he just he just has this sheer amount of energy, and he is very committed to the whole cause. Even if he gets other people to sort of do his work, he ultimately establishes his real uh, power when you really do see at the beginning how he sort of just sells himself in order to really accomplish this goal. So I think it's safe to say that he's very invested, despite the fact that he has sometimes other people do sort of his work for him. And uh, he, although he is crazy, um, you really do feel how creepy he is, and how much um, the how much being pushed out of that sort of power uh, really drove him to become even more hungry for it. Because, you know, I think it's sort of established that he did have sort of a position with them, and they eventually sort of, I guess, took that power away from him, and it made him very angry. So you can kind of see why he goes to the extreme means. And although it would have been nice had they maybe explained this more within the film, I think overall you still feel how much of a baddie he is. He really does. You really do feel the energy, the power, the greed that he has, and the lengths that he's willing to go to really intimidate the protagonists. So I think they did overall a really good job with his character, even though he is a little bit underdeveloped in maybe certain areas. But he's a whole lot of fun, and I love his song. I don't care what anyone says, I like that song. In the dark of the night, people will find her. But without further ado, let's move on to the next villain that I want to discuss, and that is Darla Dimple from Cats Don't Dance. Now, I don't think I've seen the whole extent of this film, but whenever that little girl is on camera, you really do feel like there's just something about her that just screams insanity. She is so overly spoiled. She creates this really fake innocent persona, and then when she, you know, doesn't get what she wants, she goes berserk and insane. uh, and it's nice to see that kind of a character, because it's really giving you a fake image, and it's almost relatable too, because we often sometimes see people who kind of don't really show you who you are at times, and when the real person comes out, sometimes it can be not as pleasant. And obviously with her character, we sort of see her uh, kind of really blow up and really showcase the real dark side that exists within her, and how she ultimately tries to uh, be the center of attention. And, you know, so her power kind of comes through with being fake and not being real. You know, like when she gets on stage, she pretends to be all innocent and sweet, and then once you get her behind the scenes, you really see the real ugly sort of person underneath. Um, and I think that ultimately really works, and we really don't see this in a lot of villains. In particular, I think even Disney villains, we haven't really seen a whole lot of this fake innocent persona. So it's nice to definitely see it here. And although I think it has been done in similar circumstances before, I don't think it has been done to this extent and this level. So props to you, Darla, for being a spoiled brat as well as being a very conniving, as well as just downright crazy, uh, angry little girl that you are. Third villain that I wanted to discuss is Kent Man Mannerly. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And that's from the Iron Giant film. I don't think a lot of people actually remember this guy. But I find him actually pretty interesting because although he's not really a direct politician, he works for the government, and he's kind of he although you kind of get the feeling that his intentions are good, you kind of ultimately see how they really blow up in his face. So basically, within the film, he tries to sort of get people sort of on his side, and try to c- convince them that they need to, fight against this evil force out there, um, that is trying to harm the United States, so to speak. And um, you sort of see how uh, he ultimately sort of fails into getting people to really sort of be on his side, and then ultimately he ends up doing the big villain mess up, of really almost destroying the entire human race. So I guess you could say this guy is pretty top there for being a villain, like accidentally going, oops, yeah, I made a big oopsie. And I don't really want to spoil the oopsie for people who haven't seen The Iron Giant, but you really do see that this guy, although he might have good intentions, he is just overly paranoid. He's really controlling too. He likes to control the environment. He likes to control the situation. You can really tell he wants that kind of power over people, and he really wants to intimidate them with fear. And I think that is sort of an interesting characterization of a villain, because we haven't really seen a whole lot of villains that really do that, that really do intimidate the people by not giving them something that they ultimately want, but by putting them in a state of fear. Um, and it's really interesting, and it's definitely, I think, really worth recommending watching how they execute this villain, because although he just seems like a normal guy, like he's not like Rasputin who has all these magical powers, and he's not as he doesn't really have a very out there personality like Darla, but he does have a presence, and that presence is largely based on trying to control people with fear. And in doing so, try to kind of figure out what people are hiding. He's very suspicious too. He likes to nose into people's business, which you will see within this film. So it's really, I think, well done as far as a villain is concerned, and one that people, I think, often miss because he just doesn't have that very powerful like persona, like these other villains do, or have this really big personality. But he does have these qualities to him that do really enhance the whole story, and ultimately you end up seeing how he really does a ultimate disservice and tries to do the not do the noble villain thing, but kind of just runs for the hills when he really does an oopsie. So that's really his character in a nutshell. But basically, I'm going to be moving on now to Ramses from Prince of Egypt. Um, the interesting thing about this particular villain and the way he's showcased within this film, unlike other interpretations that kind of make him a little bit more of a kind of a really sort of stern and very almost unsympathetic. This one actually tries to make him a little bit more sympathetic, although ultimately he is the villain of the story. But we initially see this within the beginning when it is established that he, as well as his brother Moses, have a very strong relationship. And in case you don't know what the Prince of Egypt is, it's basically based off of the Moses story from the Old Testament. And you see how he feels like an average normal guy, and he kind of feels intimidated by his brother because he's kind of looked down upon because he's the older one, and he's supposed to be the one that's more mature and the one that's more there's a lot more weight that's put onto his shoulders. And you ultimately see how that weight is presented when he ultimately ends up becoming sort of the villain, because he's just so blinded with the idea of power that he can't get past trying to negotiate with Moses. And he just kind of ultimately risks everything for the sake of holding on to his power, and in doing so, it ultimately impacts him in such a negative way. And I think this is why I think a lot of people like the whole Moses story in particular, is because it's supposed to emphasize this whole idea of two people realizing that one person isn't like the other person. And you see how Ramses ultimately, he's so absorbed within the lifestyle of the Egyptians, and is sort of part of that culture. And then once Moses realizes who he really is, he ultimately really flips a switch, and you see how these two forces of good and evil kind of collide with one another. And you see, though, too, how Ramses is somewhat more sympathetic, because he does try to ultimately do what's good in his eyes, even though it ends up being very destructive. And it is emphasized too within the beginning that there is not only the huge weight of power that's sort of put on his shoulders, but also the weight of the responsibility, and how he feels like giving up the whole like giving in to Moses's demands would be necessarily kind of sort of just almost destroying the Egyptian, I guess, way of life, so to speak. Even though obviously what what the Egyptians supposedly did to the Israelites was not right in any way, shape, or form. But definitely a good villain, and one with an interesting amount of depth to him as well. Another one that I wanted to mention is one that's on a little bit more of the comedic side and less serious, and that's Lord Farquaad from Shrek. This guy is funny in how egotistical he is, and yet how kind of small and insignificant he sort of looks. He's not given the very powerful like image that you see in a lot of these other villains. He's just kind of he's not as tall, and he's not as intimidating. But despite that, he kind of has everybody sort of do the work for him, so to speak. But it's just funny to see kind of also his somewhat innocence. I mean, he's almost like a child, kind of. That child that never grew up really and was never really in the real world, and he's kind of been living on a castle all his life. Well, you kind of see that in Lord Farquaad, because he has this very kind of childlike demeanor to him at points, especially when he's talking to the gingerbread man. And he's like, it's kind of creepy, because on the one hand he's like torturing him, but then on the other hand he's like, the Muffin Man who lives on Drury Lane. So he's just so kooky in the way he approaches things, and I think really DreamWorks intended that. They wanted to make him seem kind of bubbly, but at the same time very sinister and just full of himself. And he has this laziness as well to him, not really willing to really step up and do anything, just have everybody else do everything for him. And, he kind of, just does things to order people around. He conquers, he takes over Shrek, or he basically dumps all these fairy tale characters in Shrek swamp. And Shrek has to be the one to go off and fix it, as opposed to Lord Farquaad doing anything. It just that kind of, I guess, arrogance too is another thing that's really important to his character, which I think makes him rather interesting, because usually we see I think sometimes we can see similar characters where there's this certain amount of arrogance to them, but at the same time, they're so, you know, they're so far removed from the real world that they don't really know how to deal with it. So they kind of just have everybody else do the work for them, and kind of take advantage of other people and use other people to ultimately get what they want. And it's really all of that woven into this character, and I think it ultimately really works and is a lot of fun to watch. And speaking of fun to watch, the next villain that I wanted to mention is the fairy godmother from the second Shrek film. And what I find really fascinating about her characters is usually we associate the fairy godmother as being this very virtuously innocent old lady that we see in Cinderella. But I like how they totally spin this one on its head, and how she kind of does have a similar sort of fake persona that Darla possesses, but um, at the same time, she sort of is a little bit more sassy. She tries to ultimately, get what she wants, which uh, ultimately, if you've seen the film, doesn't happen. But at the same time, you do see her kind of real dedication to it, and how ultimately she's really seeking that power um, from for far, far away, to sort of be her own by kind of using her son to do it. Um, and I think we can see that in various instances within real life, where there might be some people who use other people so that they can have some kind of say and an authority. So it's very interesting to see that play out within her character, and you see her and her son kind of um, interacting, and I think it really ultimately ends up working. And I think it's interesting too, because she kind of has this very sort of, I guess, sort of fake image, and how she approaches things, and she thinks like the superficial really is the real key to happiness. And the whole idea of having all of this stuff, that she kind of makes for other people is somehow something that is worthy, is, I think, also very interesting too, because you see how ultimately, in contrast to the protagonists, Shrek and Fiona really care about the things that ultimately really matter, um, and they're not really concerned about the superficial, or having really fancy things, or um, ultimately having a real amount of power. So I think that's something that ultimately works for this particular film rather well. Um, Now the last one I'm going to mention is, I believe you pronounce it Militia Tweety. This is from Chicken Run. The reason why I think this villain is actually rather interesting is because, one, she gets her husband to do everything for her, which is hilarious. I love seeing her interact with her husband, because it's just so funny, because she's so stern with him, and he's just like this innocent man, and she's just kind of like, what did you do this time? How did you screw up? And that's just fun to watch. Those two kind of just try to be villains together, so to speak. Um, and in particular, I find it kind of fascinating, because although this is supposed to be a comedy, she is kind of gruesome in how ultimately she wants to get uh, what she wants, which really is money. I mean, it just boils down to the dollar. That's what she really wants. I mean, it's not like she wants some grander power or, some kind of, um, some kind of authority over other people. She just wants money. And she wants to use the chickens so she can ultimately get money. And in doing so, turn them into chicken pot pies, which unfortunately doesn't settle well or, end up well for the chickens. So you really do see the kind of really sort of almost evil-like quality that she possesses with this whole goal that she has. There's one point where she's like spinning the saw that's supposed to, ultimately hurt the chickens, and I'm just like, wow, lady, you're crazy. And she is so into it because she knows what the payoff is for her. And that's what she really ultimately cares about, is just the dollar. And she doesn't really, care about the sort of humanity of the chicken. She just wants to use them. And I think uh, the amount of cruelty that's used for essentially what it is, greed, I think is just you just see it ooze from her character, and I just think it really works. And you kind of see how she kind of is a controller in the sense too that she has her husband do pretty much all of the work, and then when he comes and fails, she's like, really, really, I told you to do this. I just told you to do this one simple thing, and you didn't do it for me. And I almost feel like, lady, you got to try at least on your own. I mean, but it's on the one hand hilarious because I mean her husband just goes along with it the whole entire way. I'm like, why didn't you bother to just go? I mean, did he have nowhere else to go? I guess not. But it's what you would expect from a villain like this, and I think in this case it worked out pretty well. And is fairly entertaining to watch because although she is very, very sinister, she's also very comedic because you just see the anger within her when failure happens, and you really do see how her determination is really there, but she's really she's really just doing it for money and nothing else. And that's really oftentimes we don't really see it too much in particular, I think, within animated films, because a lot of the times the villain's really motivated by power, largely. They're not really motivated just for money. Although there are villains that do want that. There's largely more so of power. But I guess with her, if she would have more money, she would feel like she would have some kind of, I guess you could say, power or some kind of, she would feel her life would feel better. But it's really her selfishness and her ego, um, and her unwillingness to do anything that ultimately thwarts her plans at the end. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say when it comes to this particular topic. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, be more than happy to answer them. And the next minion will be discussing something rather interesting as well. So if you want to hear about that, it should be all uploaded today. And I apologize, this video is being uploaded late. It took a while for myself, as well as my overlord twin minion Michelle, to um, get the regular Michelle to step aside for the channel. But until next time, everybody, bye bye.